Hello, and welcome to this webinar from me, Michael Scarty in Oxford, and from my co-convener Joseph Simmons in Oxford as well. This is the 13th event and actually the penultimate event in the second year of our Christian Literary Imagination series. It's a Georgetown University's Humanities Initiative in association with Campion Hall, Oxford, and the Las Casas Institute for Social Justice in Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. Today, Father Joe will be talking to Colleen Parsons from Georgetown University about Olive Schreiner and her book, The Story of an African Farm. After his talk, Colleen will take questions submitted from members of our internationally based audience. We encourage you, please, to participate by typing your questions directly to us from the moment we begin the session. You can do so by using your Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you have a question or questions, please ask them and we'll endeavour to answer them either today or later by email. Please ensure that you use the Q&A button. Do not use the chat button. Thanks very much. I hope you enjoyed today's talk. Over to you, Joe.
Greetings and good morning or good afternoon, wherever you're coming to us from. It's a particularly balmy day here in Oxford, so I'm dressed a little more casually than usual. Today we welcome Dr. Colleen Parsons, who is an associate professor of English at Georgetown University, where he also directs the Global Irish Studies Initiative. He's the author of the Ordnance Survey and Modern Irish Literature in 2016, and co-editor of Relocations, Reading Culture in South Africa in 2015. Dr. Parsons is working on a second monograph project underway at the moment called Telescopic Modernism, the Novel and the Planet, which looks at how modernist writers from the Anglophone world engage with the discourse and insights of astronomy in their attempts to figure the planet, which probably leads nicely into our topic today. Today, Dr. Parsons is speaking on Olive Schreiner, the South African novelist, women's rights activist, and anti-war campaigner. This talk will investigate some astronomical aspects of Herbert Spencer's 1862 book, First Principles, which is a curious book, which was his sort of religiously inflected theory of the origins of planets and stars. So Dr. Parsons considers how Schreiner's lifelong attention to the Southern African sky in novels, such as The Story of an African Farmer, how that functioned as a place of questioning and critique from a colonial standpoint. So without further ado, Colleen, we'll hand it over to you and look forward to our Q&A discussion afterwards.
Many thanks, Joe. Let me know if that screen share has worked.
I see it.
Just to keep us all slightly entertained, I have some pictures and some quotes. It is a great pleasure to be here in my office, that is. My thanks first to Joe for moderating, and to Mike Scott and Catherine Temple for the invitation, my colleague Catherine Temple here in the English department, and to Mary Gordon for keeping us all attached to the Zoom, making it all work. It's nice to see all of you online. I see a few of my colleagues. Good to see you, Nathan and Patrick. You have heard the first half of this talk before, so my apologies for that. I feel a little bit like an interloper in a conversation about the Christian literary imagination. And at first I was minded to gratefully decline the invitation because I felt I didn't know what I had to say. But then I realized that I've been reading and writing for some time about one of the great, albeit largely atheistic, religious thinkers of the 19th century, Olive Schreiner. For Schreiner, Christianity was not so much a belief system as it was a moral structure, a set of provocations for imagining a just world in the face of the injustice that she saw around her. Nowhere is this more clear than in her anti-imperialist, anti-Cecil Rhodes screed, Trooper Peter Halkett of Mashonaland, a novel, or really a novella, written in haste and in righteous anger, in which a young trooper in the British Army is confronted by a stranger. This is a pretty common feature in Schreiner's allegorical writing, who's clearly a Jesus figure. And this Jesus figure causes this trooper to rethink his mission and engage in one, ultimately suicidal, act of insubordination against the British Army. The novella opens with a scene that's characteristic of Schreiner's work. It's nighttime. It was a dark night. A chill breath was coming from the east, not enough to disturb the blaze of Trooper Peter Halkett's fire, yet enough to make it quiver. He sat alone beside it on the top of the copy. All about was an impenetrable darkness. Not a star was visible in the black curve over his head. This time it's a black night, but more often Schreiner's skies are vivid with stars, such as in her first published novel, The Story of an African Farm. There's a quote from Story of an African Farm. It'll sound familiar. Waldo walked with his eyes bent upon the ground, but overhead it was one of those brilliant southern nights when every space so small that your hand might cover it shows 50 cold white points, and the Milky Way is a belt of sharp, frosted silver. So it's this, Schreiner's acute and ever-present attention to the night sky, that I want to talk about today, because it draws from and is in constant conversation with a theory of star formation that exercised the minds of astronomers, philosophers, religious figures, and political theorists of the 19th century. And you'll see behind it all a constant current of religious anxiety in what we could possibly call a secularizing age, or at least an age in which, so via Herbert, Spencer, and others, the idea of a secular future was imaginable. This talk is drawn from my book project, as Joe suggested, a historical literary investigation of our knowledge of the planet and of planetary thinking, of the ways that knowledge of, or often actually speculation about the skies, mediates and refracts our understanding of the human world, and is expressed in my case, and this is my own historical interest, in modernist form, that is in largely prose from the late 19th and early 20th century. I should warn you that I've bitten off a little bit more than I can chew in this talk, having imagined 2 months ago that I could somehow fit all of this in. So just a warning that this may seem a little bit overfull, or there may be holes in it as a result of that. I want to start today with a picture with one of the great, if now somewhat esoteric seeming, philosophical controversies of the 19th century. The debate centers around the question of the composition of nebulae, those hazy, cloudy elements of the night sky. What constitutes a nebula? Whether gas or dust, or millions of tiny, unresolved and very far away stars, and whether their shape was fixed or changing, and at what speed, was one of the great unknowns of 19th century astronomy. It turns up as a constant question for Leopold Bloom in Ulysses, so it carries over into the 20th century, a question of gas balls spinning about, as Leopold Bloom says. The so-called nebular hypothesis, or the nebular theory, in reality, a whole family of theories, put forward with varying degrees of conviction and knowledge by Swedenborg, by Kant, by Simon Laplace, and others, suggested that nebulae were vast gaseous zones in which stars and planets were formed. They are, however, ultimately formless things. And I want to call out a recent essay by literary critic Devin Garofalo, a beautiful essay on the idea of formlessness and the problem of formlessness in nebulae. I'll turn to the work of the historian of science, Simon Schaefer, here to summarize the cultural and the philosophical importance of what was at ground an astronomical question: whether the solar system evolved or was somehow willed into existence, went to the very heart of arguments in the early 19th century about evolution, progress, and the existence of a natural law that determines human life on Earth. To give you an idea of this is John Pringle Nichol, a political economist who dabbled in astronomy precisely to find a natural law. He declared in 1837 that in the vast heavens, as well as among phenomena around us, all things are in a state of change and progress. There too, on the sky, in splendid hieroglyphs, the truth is inscribed, and the grandest form of present being are only germs swelling and bursting with a life to come. If we could just prove, Nichol thought, that the heavens themselves progressed from nebulous gas and dust to stars, systems, and planets, we would have proof of the fundamental and inexorable laws of progress here on Earth, giving a natural law boost to the workings of reformers. Pringle's friend and collaborator, John Stuart Mill, also saw the need for an overarching theory of progress. For he wrote, "The fundamental problem of sociology is to find the laws according to which any state of society produces the state which succeeds it and takes its place. This opens the great and vexed question of the progressiveness of man and society, an idea involved in every just conception of social phenomena as the subject of science. And Mill himself was profoundly interested in the nebular hypothesis, and also in the work of Auguste Comte and other, obviously as a positivist, and Comte was waded into the nebular hypothesis and the questions of the hypothesis. This hypothesis was its overarching conception of the gradual and deliberative creation of the solar system. That is to say that planets, stars, and all of the bodies were made from these gaseous forms. The nebular hypothesis is just such a rational and science-based foundation for the fantasies of progressivist philosophy that Mill is looking for, which is why he sort of attaches himself to it, for the domestication of the alterity of the cosmos into a human-centered obsession. Mill, by the way, had John Pringle Nichol read the proofs of his system of logic, and we can see Nichol's imprint all over Mill's system of logic. Nichol was not the first to suggest that nebulae were sites of star and planet formation. As I said, Immanuel Kant, with no sort of observational knowledge, wrote of it at length in his Universal Natural History and Theory of the Heavens, though entirely from a theoretical standpoint. And Pierre-Simon Laplace gave the theory depth, but it was John Pringle Nichol and William Whewell, that great inventor of neologisms. In fact, it was William Whewell who invented the term the nebular hypothesis, along with something that is quite evocative for us today, the word catastrophism. Whewell and Pringle together, and Nichol together, made the nebular hypothesis a cause célèbre in the 1830s and the 1840s. Nichol's mesmerizing lectures on the subject appealed to mass audiences. And it was Nichol who brought the logic of the Kant-Laplace hypothesis into the sphere of human progress, instrumentalizing astronomical conjectures on the origins of the universe. His work was explosive and had a transformative effect on Herbert Spencer. Even as Herbert Spencer himself in the 1850s and then even in the 1860s stepped back a little bit from the easy moralizing of Nichol's position and tried to build a wall between scientific research and immediate human consequences. This is Spencer writing in First Principles, as Joe said, a rather strange book, but an incredible sort of overarching, universalizing idea of our world. The current conception is a teleological one, he wrote. The phenomena are contemplated solely as bearing on human happiness. Only those changes are held to constitute progress which directly or indirectly tend to heighten human happiness. And they're thought to constitute progress simply because they tend to heighten human happiness. But rightly to understand progress, we must learn the nature of these things, these changes, considered apart from our interest, ceasing, for example, to regard the successive geological modifications that have taken place in the Earth as modifications that have gradually fitted it for the habitation of man, and as therefore constituting geological progress. We must ascertain the character common to these modifications, the laws to which they all conform. And similarly, in every other case, leaving out of sight concomitants and beneficial consequences, let us ask what progress is in itself. And here you see it's a sort of a theory of change rather than a theory of accretion of goods. But Spencer's first principle in his book, First Principles, was the nebular hypothesis, an form of social evolution that he saw in the world around him, and physical evolution that he saw in the world around him, an irrefutable proof of the validity of his system built on Nichol's work, and a constant presence throughout the work as a sort of guarantor of his entire system of thought. I'll get to Olive Schreiner shortly, but I want to sort of lay out, in a sense, the elements of this question, the elements of what it means to even look at the skies in the 19th century before we get to Schreiner's sort of particular kind of looking. I introduced Nichol to you as someone who dabbled in astronomy, and the description is probably accurate, but he managed to be appointed professor of astronomy at the University of Glasgow and director of the observatory there, even though he had no observational experience, or in fact, possibly any capacity for mathematical astronomy. His advocacy of the nebular hypothesis as an indicator of natural law was strenuously objected to by many other astronomers, most notably John Herschel, one of the three founders of modern nebular observation, along with his father William and his aunt Caroline, but also by two Irish astronomers, the Earl of Ross and Thomas Romney Robinson. And also on top of that, the hidden figure in this photograph, I'm just showing you Thomas Romney Robinson, in part because I like this photograph of the sort of austere astronomer. But the photograph was taken by Mary Ross, who was the wife of the Earl of Ross. And in her work as a blacksmith, as an architect, as an early experimenter in photography, not to mention her prodigious wealth, was a major figure in nebular science in the 19th century. To pause at Robinson for a minute, he was director of the Armagh Observatory and a Church of Ireland minister, which is to say Episcopalian or Anglican minister. He was also incidentally Maria Edgeworth's brother-in-law and a deeply conservative actor, firmly opposed to Catholic emancipation in Ireland of any kind, or in Britain either of any kind, and later almost apoplectic over the 1868 disestablishment of the Church of Ireland. Not only on political grounds, he objected to the disestablishment of Protestantism as a religion in Ireland, but also because it was a move that would remove the principal source of funding for his observatory in Armagh, which was run by Romney under the auspices of the Church of Ireland. Romney is a key figure in nebular theory, not because of any great discovery, but because of his place in convincing Ross to build the world's largest telescope in order to resolve nebulae into stars where possible, and thereby disprove the nebular hypothesis by offering proof that what appeared to be nebulous, when looked at by inferior telescopes, were in fact fully formed stars and planets. The universe for Robinson was not in a stage of formation, but had been fully willed into complete existence by an omnipotent God. Robinson was very much swimming against the tide, with even fellow clergymen like Whewell now convinced of the value of the nebular hypothesis. In their opposition to this nebular hypothesis, Robinson and Ross evince a particular form of anti-progressivism that had profound implications for the question of whether progress was the outworking of a natural law. I'm thinking back, I'm thinking in the back of my mind here of Walter Benjamin and his phrase, "that which we call progress," and how this is one of the areas in the critique of liberalism that we see in Robinson, where deep conservatism and its opposite meet around the back of liberalism. We'll come back to that at the end of the talk if we have time. In 1845, Ross published, along with Robinson, who'd been working with, published a truly sensational image of what he called the Great Spiral Nebula, arguing that he'd seen it so clearly that he could resolve it into stars, and that this nebula at least was not forming into stars, but was entirely composed of them, that what looked like gas was in fact fully formed objects. In so doing, he claimed to have taken a step towards disproving. He also actually made this claim about the nebula in Orion, which was absolutely sensational, also wrong. He claimed to have taken a step towards disproving the nebular hypothesis and establishing the fixed and unchanging nature of the universe, designed and delivered complete by God. Although he did not know it, what he'd actually found was the first compelling visual evidence of the existence of other galaxies, only to be confirmed by Hubble in the 1920s. And if the image seems vaguely familiar to you, probably doesn't, but I'll show you this anyway. You're on the right track. Omar Nazim, in a really beautiful book on the hand drawings of astronomers in the 19th century, has argued that the centerpiece of Van Gogh's painting is an interpreted reproduction of Ross's celebrated drawing. Given the more favorable conditions, however, so I should say that while Ross did manage to actually make some observations, his telescope was in the middle of Ireland. While he did manage to make some observations, he was stymied by two things. Number one, the weather, which was frequently awful, and number two, the famine. So between 1845 and 1851, Ross stopped observation entirely and spent most of his work on famine relief. I don't want to set him up as some kind of a saint here, because he was also very much in favor of quite an austere form of famine relief and in the transportation of the poor. But there were more favorable conditions for viewing nebulae elsewhere, especially in the Southern Hemisphere, at the Cape, and in Australia, where the weather was better. And the race was on to build a large-scale fixed telescope south of the equator. For a variety of reasons, the first of these was located in Melbourne, paid for by money from the gold rush in Victoria, and built in Dublin by a then unknown instrument maker by the name Grubb, who had worked with Ross and Robinson. But the Great Melbourne Telescope wasn't originally designed for Melbourne at all, but for the Cape of Good Hope. Starting in the late 1840s, a group of astronomers, including Robinson and Ross, began to seriously consider siting a large telescope in the Southern Hemisphere. They discussed it over the next few years and hoped to locate it at altitude at the Cape, one of the most easily accessible points in the south, where astronomical observation had already had a long and distinguished history, thanks to the work of John and Caroline Herschel in particular, but also others. And the question here is about sort of the location of knowledge and the location of the sort of formation of the potential future knowledge about nebulae. Among these sort of, in this what we might call, following Joseph Conrad, an outpost of progress in the Cape. The attempt was to see, to understand what progress might look like in astronomical terms. But at the same time, this is where we move to Olive Schreiner. We see at this point and in this place emerging a critique of that very same progress, a critique of the world of Herbert Spencer. In the early 1870s, a young man named Willie Bertram called to a remote farm in South Africa's Karoo, that semi-desert region just beyond the coast of the present-day Western Cape, that marked at the time the frontier of European expansion, though long traversed and variously inhabited by Khoi and San people, of course. He brought with him and gave to a young girl there who would grow up to be one of South Africa's most clear-eyed and influential intellectuals, a copy of Herbert Spencer's First Principles. Olive Schreiner fictionalized her receipt of this gift in her story, in her novel, The Story of an African Farm. It also turns up in another novel, Undine, where in fact, she talks a lot more about Spencer, but Spencer becomes a sort of a cipher rather than actually something to be engaged with, as does John Stuart Mill. But she fictionalizes the receipt of this gift in The Story of an African Farm by having Waldo, one of the memorably complex characters of the novel, encounter a stranger who gives him a book. The effect of Schreiner's first encounter with Spencer was transformative. I always think, Schreiner wrote in a letter to her friend, Havelock Ellis. That's a really incredibly interesting relationship between Olive Schreiner and Havelock Ellis. I always think, Schreiner wrote to Havelock Ellis, that when Christianity burst on the dark Roman world, it was what that book was to me. Spencer's First Principles, in which the nebular hypothesis takes pride of place, was a path-breaking work of its time, establishing a synthetic view of ultimate equilibrium, or a synthetic view of natural and human history that defined evolution as the single basic process that was at work in the entire cosmos. It was a new form of secular philosophy that the free-thinking Schreiner was immediately attracted to. But at the same time, its adhesion to the secular gospel of inevitable progress sat increasingly uncomfortably with Schreiner, who in The Story of an African Farm reached for a universal law, not of stasis, not of progress, but of stasis, written in the stars. The driving optimism of Spencer's work, but also its emerging social Darwinism, was increasingly at odds with the material realities of life on the colonial frontier, where progress was inseparable from violence, exploitation, extinction, and extraction. Equilibrium faded rapidly out of sight. Here, where Herschel had mapped the nebulae, the nebular hypothesis meets its limit. A word about Schreiner's novel, in case you don't know, you might not be familiar with it. I lean pretty heavily on some contemporary reviews to give you a flavor of it, not to summarize it, but to give you a flavor of it. In his comment on the book in the Fortnightly Review, a notice that actually catapulted Schreiner, as she was writing under the pseudonym Ralph Iron, to immediate fame, Henry Norman wrote, "Orthodox Christianity, Unitarian Christianity, woman suffrage, marriage, Malthusianism, immortality, they all arise over the horizon of this African farm. For Norman, the novel is the story of the growth of a human mind cut off from all but the most commonplace influences, facing its own doubts, crushing its own and others' deceits, and at last beating out a music which is not very melodious, but which is thoroughly honest." When Schreiner submitted the manuscript initially in 1882 to Macmillan to be published, it was read by John Morley, soon to become Chief Secretary for Ireland and then Secretary of State for India, who rejected it. Schreiner appears to have pursued the matter, and the next letter from Macmillan says that they had sought further clarification from the reader, Morley, and quote, "In spite of certain qualities in your writing that attracted him, he cannot honestly recommend your adopting literature as a profession." She was obviously not put off by this, becoming one of the most prolific writers in Southern Africa in the late 19th century. The novel was eventually favorably reviewed by George Meredith for Chapman and Hall, and of course published in 1883. So George Meredith was the sort of internal reviewer. Edward Aveling, Eleanor Marx's partner and Schreiner's friend, wrote that it had, quote, not a little local coloring, but had universal appeal nonetheless. In the preface to the second edition, Schreiner takes a little bit of offense at this and writes that a critic suggested that her novel should have been a history of wild adventure, of cattle driven into inaccessible kranzes by bushmen, of encounters with ravening lions and their hairbreadth escapes. But such tales, she wrote, were best written in Piccadilly or in the Strand. So the novel was, when it arrives, something of a catachresis of a novel. The term and the form as it existed was inadequate to the experience of this colonial writer. I don't want to belabor the point, and I don't want to make some sort of categorical argument about whether the novel is modernist or whether it is a novel. But what I want to emphasize is that it was and remains out of joint. And so is time within it. And all of this is sort of keyed to Schreiner's interest in astronomy and the stars. The South African Karoo, where Schreiner read Spencer and penned her own novel, was in the 19th century, and arguably still is, a site of an everyday negotiation between the nested but also incompatible scales of human time and space, and the unavoidable scales of geological and astronomical time. When in 1925, Jan Christian Smuts said that our Bushmen are nothing but living fossils, it was a moment of very strange and obviously deeply racist national pride for him, as he laid out an argument about the union of South Africa's in situ deep time. It was not, for Smuts, a new state at all, but it was a state that was formed over eons. With the starry sky above and fossil records and rock art of various ages all around, the Karoo became a testing ground on which all kinds of theories of time and space were proven and disproven, as the South African historian Saul Dubois has written. Modernists might be accustomed to thinking about tensions between personal time and clock time, drawing on Henri Bergson and others. But modernity is also marked, and we'll see this in the story of an African farm, by a tension between human geological and astronomical time. Known in caricature really for its attachment to the new and the now, the transient and the emergent, modernism is also in its peripheral emergence here in South Africa, attuned to the natural and timeless worlds of rocks and stars. Indeed, Schreiner hones in on this sense of human life, a sense that human life is but a mere thin strip sandwich between slow, unrolling, unfeeling, non-human processes that are indifferent to our dreams of progress and perfection. To return again to one of the quotes that I read at the opening, Waldo walked with his eyes bent upon the ground, but overhead it was one of those brilliant southern nights, when every space so small that your hand might cover it shows 50 cold white points, and the Milky Way is a belt of sharp, frosted silver. It's a novel that is full of stars, which speak both eloquently and obtusely. Schreiner's stars are marked by a politics of impossibility. They are ungraspable, unimaginable, undifferentiated. They speak again and again throughout the novel of and from an expansive and usually static time against which human striving is futile. There is, the narrator tells us, a laughing irony in the stars. As Waldo kneels down at one moment, looking up, he imagines the stars mocking him. We, said the stars, have seen the earth when it was young. We've seen small things creep out upon its surface, small things that prayed and loved and cried very loudly and then crept under it again. But we, said the stars, are as old as the unknown. Older even than the rock art that surrounds the farm. The stars speak to a time far beyond the comprehension of humanity and the pretensions of human progress. They speak to a sort of a non-teleological, non-Christian, sort of ever-present reality and ever-present time. One of the characters of the novel, the fiercely feminist Lyndall, asks Waldo, "Do you not see the stars? There's a little white mocking finger pointing down at us from each one of them. We're talking of tomorrow and tomorrow." There's a sort of a Macbeth touch in there. We're talking of tomorrow and tomorrow, and our hearts are so strong, we're not thinking of something that can touch us softly in the dark and make us still forever. They're laughing at us, Waldo. I can only give you a taste today in the time that I have of this baggy novel, but I want to emphasize the unerring, recurring attention to the heavens that butts up against and recalibrates Spencer's commitment to the nebular hypothesis as an instance of a universal law of evolutionary change. In the face of the novel's relentless documentation of the violence of life on the colonial frontier at the time of the frenzy of the gold and diamond rushes, the secular philosophy of progress begins to lose its grip. Here's Waldo lamenting the needless death of his friend Lyndall. There we go, that's a previous quote actually. He looked up into the night sky that all his life long had mingled itself with his existence. There were 1,000 faces that he loved looking down at him. 1,000 stars in their glory and crowns and circles and solitary grandeur. To the man, they were not less dear than to the boy they had been not less mysterious. Yet he looked up at them and shuddered, at last turned away from them with horror. Such countless multitudes stretching out far into space, and yet none in one of them all was she. Though he searched through them all to the furthest, faintest point of light, nowhere should he ever say she is here. Tomorrow's sun would rise and gild the world's mountains and shine into its 1,000 valleys. It would set and the stars creep out again, year after year, century after century. The old changes of nature would go on, day and night, summer and winter, seed time and harvest. But in none of them all would she have part. He shut the door to keep out their hideous shining. This is part of Waldo's sort of a central element of the novel is Waldo's turn away from religion and his impatience with the possibility of a God, a just God who would allow such an unjust world to exist. The paradox here is that Schreiner is deeply invested in Spencerian evolution, as Caroline Burdett has shown, particularly around the idea of the evolution of women's rights, that is to say, the progress of feminism drawn from idea of a universal progress. Yet her image of progress is shattered, fragmented, aleatory. A shadow of progressivism remains, but it hangs over an intellectual project that gives the lie to its assumptions. The result is a broken novel, a mix of styles and discourse, a novel of ideas awkwardly shoehorned into, at times, a comedy, at times, a romance. An unapologetic early feminist novel shot through with a deep pessimism, and a Bildungsroman in which the possibility of Bildung is forestalled, as Jed Este points out. It is, in short, out of joint with itself, forging an early modernism at the edge of empire. It's an aesthetic formed at the encounter of the abstract schemes of 19th century astronomy and the realities of the colonial frontier, and one in which the stars return again and again to mock our desire, as too does God, to establish a universal law. But lest we think the influence here was all one way, Schreiner absorbing astronomical science and commenting on it, or absorbing it via Herbert Spencer, although she did actually read others too. I want to end this talk with a long quote from David Gill. Gill was the astronomer at the Royal Observatory in Cape Town. He gave a lecture, really interesting character, who in a sense figured out the possibility of astrophotography or astrography. But he gave a lecture at the Kimberley exhibition at the Diamond Mines in 1892, which was convened to celebrate Kimberley's great good fortune at the center of the diamond mining industry. This lecture cannot have gone down that well. If we are to regard this exhibition as illustrating the material progress of South Africa, and if we are to define that material progress in the way that too many are disposed to do as merely progress in material wealth, if the question, what is the use of it, is to be answered in the sense of the vulgar questioner, who generally means, will it contribute to my wealth or my comfort? Then to such a question I reply, to you the observatory is of no use whatever. Its progress and its work do not concern you. But to those who recognize that knowledge and truth are things worth having for their own sake, to those who in their hearts can understand all of Schreiner's beautiful allegory and believe that to win one feather from the wings of the bird of truth is a high reward for the most arduous life and become a precious bequest to future generations. To such men, the work of the Cape Observatory and its astronomers is intelligible. It's an extraordinary moment in which Gill chastises the grubbers after money and points them to a complex and delicate allegory in the story of an African farm, aligning astronomy and its concerns with the humanistic project of, in a great quote from the novel, a striving and a striving and an ending in nothing. To know literature is to appreciate astronomy, Gill implies, and to know both is to question the reduction of the laws of the universe to a justification of humanity. Here, in the face of the realities of colonial violence and extractive capitalism on the frontier, the anti-colonial liberalism of Schreiner and Gill meet in a strange way the Christian philosophical conservatism of Thomas Romney Robinson, who may have been wrong on the science, but right on the relentless critique of its philosophical outworkings. These debates are played out in the realm of the stars and in the heady arguments over the nebular hypothesis, but they come down in the end to a critique of both the philosophy and the political economy of progress, a necessary corrective from our standpoint, at the beginning of this century, as the dialectic of economic progress, at least, or what Gill calls material progress, has made itself ever more visible. To go back to that William Whewell word, catastrophism. For Schreiner, writing at the beginning of the scramble for Africa, the search begins in literary forms for an alternative reading of the sort of moral shape of our universe. I'll leave it at that. I think I'm just out of time, and I really welcome questions.
Right. Thank you, Colleen, for a fascinating paper covering a lot of ground in science and relation of science and religion, which was Spencer's topic, obviously, but then also how that gets cashed out and fleshed out narratively in literature. So I think I have quite a few questions myself, and I welcome people to send their questions to Q&A. I suppose for me, maybe the first question I have is, how did you get interested in this particular field? Did this come from reading Schreiner and saying this is sort of a fascinating history that hasn't been told yet? Or, I mean, or did you begin with some background in science and then come to literature later?
Oh God, no, I'm a complete amateur. In the great tradition of the 19th century, I'd be more on the Thomas Romney Robinson end of things. No, it did begin with a reading of Schreiner. And it began for me, this particular part of the book began for me because I moved to Georgetown from Cape Town, South Africa, where I did actually begin looking into the history of astronomy at the Cape, and thinking about this as one of the sort of institutions of 19th century empire building. But the story became, I think, significantly more complicated once I began to understand the jagged history of the forms of knowledge that were created at the Cape and also in Australia and elsewhere, and in India and elsewhere. The jagged history of the forms of knowledge that were created and the ways they sort of become a really located idea of science, give us a really located idea of scientific knowledge, that anything that we know about astronomy must be read through a sort of a social history of the moment and the place of its knowing. And I think, you know, Schreiner herself was very attuned to this idea of a located sense of knowing, and that's why I ended with the idea of Schreiner's sort of searching for forms in many ways. And I'll go back to that great essay by Devin Garofalo about nebulae as sort of formless, and in many ways part of my interest in nebula was through Olive Schreiner's kind of strange, formless, journalistic, novelistic writing that always seemed to be sort of throwing out ideas and arguments and philosophies nonstop. So it began both ways, really, both in an interest in the history of science, amateur interest in the history of science, but also a real sense of Schreiner's place as an inventor of form at the colonial frontier.
Oh, interesting. So is this Garofalo's argument that sort of, just as you have sort of this formless nebula spreading ideas out, so too that gets cashed out in literature, like in Schreiner, or say in later modernist writers like Virginia Woolf, whom I read?
Yeah, I mean that's me sort of riffing off on that. Really, Garofalo is interested in the sort of the play between form and formlessness in the 19th century. You know, interesting that you pick up Virginia Woolf. Obviously, here Woolf was obsessed with astronomy, but a very different kind, not necessarily the observation. I mean, if you think of any, Night and Day, say, she is interested in sort of the human eye looking into the stars, but then it becomes when Woolf sort of takes up after Eddington, and after, sort of Eddington in 1919, in the eclipse of 1919, proving Einstein right, that light particles can indeed move around and sort of gravity fields. Wolf sort of goes down a quite different road towards what we might now recognize as not observational astronomy, but kind of a theoretical astronomy that is quantum, rather than the sort of simple mechanical or sort of geometrical ideas of astronomy in the 19th century. And so that becomes a sort of really productive, in many ways, field for Virginia Woolf. There's good work by Holly Henry and a couple of other people on Woolf and that stuff. I mean, we'd also look at somebody like, I mentioned Joyce already. We'd also look at somebody like Joseph Conrad, or even the person who can't escape here is H.G. Wells. The idea that that world out there is actually for us to find and to imagine for ourselves. Or Stapleton is another one. Yeah.
You mentioned too, and I don't know if this was your quotation or somebody else, something of stars is the politics of impossibility, that the stars are ever present, non-Christian or pre-Christian or post-Christian, non-teleological. Where did that idea come from? Was that yours, or was that something you found in Schreiner's writing, or from somebody else?
Yeah, I mean, it's a sort of a combination. Part of it draws from sort of more contemporary theory about arguments about the planet and planetarity in literary studies. I'm drawing a little bit from Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak in her work Death of a Discipline, but actually substantially that comes from Schreiner.
Okay.
Where they become sort of this inscrutable form that gaze down, that are unimaginable, that are beyond our ken, and that lead us to understand the limits of human capacity and the limits of human knowledge and the limits of our ability to imagine the shape or the form of the universe. And they become this sort of like forbidding constant presence in all of Schreiner's work. And I would go back to that phrase, a striving and a striving and an ending in nothing. That is in many ways, what her turn towards the sky gives us, is a sense of the impossibility of human action. Even as she was, as you mentioned in your introduction, she was an anti-war activist. She was a sort of early feminist. She was certainly a women's rights activist. She was a really sort of engaged citizen. And yet philosophically, in many ways, she questioned the very idea of that engagement, or the idea of imagining a future world. That was a sort of a kind of act of hubris, and its own kind of act of violence. She lived in a, we do it all the time now, but she lived in a time where you think about, she had an interesting relationship with Cecil Rhodes, to speak of Oxford. She had an interesting relationship with Rhodes. She thought at the time, when Rhodes was sort of first working in Southern Africa, she expected that Rhodes would be a great reformer, and that he would bring energy and commitment to the imperial project and make the imperial project somehow more, I don't know, rational in some way. And she obviously turned very, very radically against that during the Anglo-Boer War. But Rhodes, of course, on his deathbed, allegedly, according to William T. Stead, who we may or may not believe, said that wished that he could annex the stars. And that's the sort of the world in which both Gill, the astronomer, and Olive Schreiner are living. What I didn't mention was that Gill's quote there at the end was essentially a rebuke to Cecil Rhodes.
Oh, that's a fascinating connection there. Cecil Rhodes statue just down the road from here.
Oh no, there isn't, is there? Wait, it's still there?
It's still there. We've got a number of questions coming in, and they center around this question of the Christian literary imagination, specifically. Yeah. The first one, and I have a scriptural passage I'm curious to tie it in from, because I think it deals with sort of the outworkings of where this stuff comes from. This comes from Catherine Temple. At the beginning of your talk, you mentioned the issue of having nothing to say about the Christian literary imagination, and she had the same thought herself. Do you think this is related to our secular age, and that because we feel distance from Christianity for various reasons, we don't tend to recognize the influences in the texts we read as related to Christianity, or more generally to theology / religion? I certainly see this in 18th century studies.
Yeah, yeah, Catherine. I would certainly see that as a block in my own formation in many ways, in part because of the sort of the intellectual tradition in which I grew up, partly which is drawing from post-colonial studies and the subaltern studies group, and the idea of religion being a sort of a problem in many ways for a kind of a material understanding of literature and anything else. And so, I mean, Schreiner herself was and not to go back to Schreiner, I mean, just to sort of to answer your question, Catherine, in some way, via this, is that Schreiner herself was a pretty fascinating character who was deep, and she grew up on a mission. Her father was a German missionary, and she grew up on a mission in South Africa, and she sort of traveled around as a governess. And she was deeply involved in and deeply sort of formed by religious knowledge. But she was also, and this is where Spencer sort of bursts into her world. And I love the fact that her analogy is that it's as if when Christianity arrived in the Roman world, it sort of exploded that world. And Spencer, with a sort of an eye to religious sort of ideas of totality and even teleology, produces an entire theory without God, even though the first section of first principles is essentially saying, no, these are compatible, right? And that's this, along with a whole lot of other stuff that Schreiner is reading, brings her to a sort of a deeply religiously informed secular ethics in some way, right? And a desire to find a replacement for what she sees as no longer possible, but that she desires to find that sort of like totalizing replacement. And she sees it in Spencer, and Spencer is, again, sort of bursts onto the scene in many ways, but then Spencer doesn't align with the reality, particularly the gendered reality of her life. Right? Spencer doesn't align with this sort of the reality of what it is to be a woman on the frontier. I think about that phrase, when Christianity burst onto the Roman world, and then thinking about like what Spencer would be. I think about that a lot in relation to W.B. Yeats's The Second Coming. The sort of the idea that there is that an age has passed, that some rough beast is slouching toward Bethlehem to be born, but she's not sure that previously the Sphinx had been raised to vexation. But now some rough beast slouches toward Bethlehem to be born, but she's not sure what it is. But she knows the form, and the form is sort of organized religion, and the form is a kind of a God who both guarantees the future, but also in many ways is, like the stars, is indifferent to human suffering in the creation of that future. So back to Catherine's question, because this draws from a sort of a substantially written longer chapter in which I mentioned none of this, and I was interested to sort of go back and try and thread through. Not that I did a whole lot of it in this talk, but just even forming the talk, interested in trying to go back and thread through Schreiner's sort of scientific imagination, a sense of how this becomes a kind of a religion substitute in some way.
Yes. Well, perhaps to borrow from Yeats, the falcon cannot hear the falconer anymore. So can't even recognize sort of the maybe the religious roots of some of these things. The passage in scripture I was thinking of in all this talk about the stars was Genesis chapter 15, when the Lord speaks to Abram and says, try to count all the stars here. You will have more descendants than you can count in the sky above your head. So there's a sense of, I think that would kind of be a more robust, historically religious conception of a continuity between a theological take on things and the natural world, and marveling at the natural world that's not in competition with a theological explanation of things.
I'll just throw in just for a second when you think about looking at the stars and counting the stars. I'll throw in. So I mentioned that David Gill was a fascinating character. One of the reasons this was the astronomer at the Cape, whom Schreiner knew well, and not to bring this always back to astronomy, but Gill was photographing a comet in 1882, the year that Schreiner tried to get the book published. It was eventually published in 1883. Gill was photographing a comet in 1882, and he used, for one of the first times, he used a camera attached to a telescope, and had as long an exposure as he could, which is not very long, obviously, because you would worry about the wavering telescope. And when he developed it, because of the long exposure, he saw hundreds more celestial bodies than he could have imagined were even there using the telescope. And this was the sort of, if we think about spectroscopy as the great breakthrough in nebular theory, then the great breakthrough in trying to actually map the scale of the universe was astrophotography. And then we come to back to these questions of the impossibility of the human eye to capture the sort of sublimity. And so much of Schreiner's work is filled with a sort of a sublime terror of a world that is beyond our world, that we cannot see, that we cannot imagine, and that offers a sort of a rebuke to the scale of human endeavors and the scale of human wants and time. And that, that in many ways is a sort of a, if we think about that, that's a sort of a religious recognition in some way, driven through an astronomical figure.
Mm-hmm. Oh, great, thank you. Tied into that question of Spencer and stars, Sarah McNamara from, I think I'm saying your name right, pardon me if I'm not, from Medieval Studies at Georgetown, if memory serves, writes, such an interesting talk, thank you. Does Schreiner engage directly with the notion of happiness as she ponders the stars? I ask because if Spencer's notion of progress rests on whatever will heighten human happiness, it's obviously a core notion in this interesting mix you're engaging with here.
Yeah, Sarah. Hi, Sarah. Thanks for listening. That's a great question, and the answer is yes. Not sort of very specifically in the story of an African farm. Yes, Waldo, who is, I mean, part of it is like the novel is so filled with the sort of anxieties of Schreiner's world. So Waldo is a character whose name is taken from Ralph Waldo Emerson. There's a whole nother story to be told about Emerson's, Agatha Szczeszak-Brewer is a great scholar, has written about Emerson's sort of, racial theorization and how Schreiner takes Emerson's racial theorization and applies it to South Africa. But in many ways, Waldo is sort of the character who is most keyed into the idea of happiness and the idea of contentment, the idea of the possibility of living a life of happiness and the possibility of heightening human happiness. And he is profoundly disappointed in this. He's the guy who gets the book, which ends up being First Principles. Otto Schreiner tells. We don't know the name of the book from the novel, but Schreiner tells us that she means it to be First Principles. So he's the guy to whom another stranger, hands the book First Principles, and he is sort of, his mind is blown by this, and he searches for the sort of the possibility of a perfect life, not for sort of a perfection of a human world, but a perfect life for himself. He, ultimately his father dies, he is beaten roughly, he loses all religion, the person for whom he conceives a great love dies. I mean, and in the end, he himself dies. This is a novel of profound disappointment and yet meditation on the possibility of happiness, even in the face of violence. So yeah, thanks, Sarah, for that. We don't see it so much in the other. It's certainly not there in Trooper Peter Halkett or Undine or From Man to Man, although obviously when Schreiner writes about gender politics and sort of women's rights, central to that is the idea of the potential pursuit of our ways to heighten human happiness and to sort of right size, in many ways, the world of human happiness around gender. I will say that Schreiner is frequently a disappointing character when it comes to race. Her inability to recognize, or her sort of the way that Black South African characters become ciphers in the novel, and they are outside of the sort of economies of desire and happiness. and not just here but elsewhere. She also, she then becomes in many ways a patron thinker for the South African National Native Congress, which becomes the ANC, and a great South African writer, Saul Pleitjie, who himself wrote about comets, named his child after Schreiner. So she becomes a sort of a figure for liberation and a figure for a kind of, political happiness in some way, but she's a somewhat problematic patron of that.
Yes, it's interesting, and thank you, Sarah. We miss having you here at Campion Hall. Sarah came and stayed for a few months with us here. A question, this will be the last question, and then we'll hand it back to Mike Scott. This one comes from Mike Scott, and it ties into the question of feminism. He says that Margaret Drabble wrote of Schreiner that she was a pioneer both in her treatment of women and her fictional use of the African landscape, end quote. Yet, as Mike asks, she published at first under the male name of Ralph Iron. Do you think she was aware through her lifetime that she was making a difference? So that she was held up maybe on later on in life. Do you think she had a sense as she was writing through her writing career that she was making a difference, or as a feminist icon?
Yeah, I mean, I think, if you think about, I'm trying to remember what age she was. She was quite young when she published Story of an African Farm under Ralph Iron. She did publish other novels under the name Ralph Iron, in part because of, and it was pretty clear pretty early on that who this was. But she published other novels under the name Ralph Iron, in part because of sort of what we might call brand recognition. But she certainly, especially, in Undine, which is again, to use that word that I used at the beginning of the talk, which is a righteous novel, filled with anger and indignation. We get the sense of Schreiner being a very, very clear voice. She was also a prolific allegorist. She wrote these strange allegories, but she was also a prolific journalist. She was a real public figure. So she lived in a tiny village for a lot of her life called Mitjiesfontein. And the train line from Johannesburg to Cape Town went through and stopped in Mitjiesfontein. And Otto Schreiner's cottage was a sort of a stop on the route for people. And she was a real public figure in the world of the sort of the negotiation of the politics of liberation, or the politics of anti-colonialism, or the politics of race, or the politics of whatever in the emerging South Africa. Again, a complicated figure, but she was very much a public figure and a public speaker, both on women's rights, but also on largely on the rights of settlers in the empire versus the center. And that's why she thought Cecil Rhodes would become a sort of a godlike figure. Turns out he did become a godlike figure, but not the kind of godlike figure she was looking for. I see a comment there from Mike Collins, reminded of Hopkins's The Starlight Night, in that he says that the poem, in that poem, the stars are imagined as the fence that creates a homeland for Christ, Mary, and the saints, a different conception of the stars, but very much, sort of an imagination of what this thing above us could be. If we think about human life as that thin line between the earth and the stars, when we can imagine, you can think what the ground is for, but there's a lot of scope for imagining what that black or sort of
silver night in front and
on top of you is for. Thanks, Mike. Nice to see you, even if virtually.
Well.
Colleen, thank you. I'm going to hand over to a different mic, to Michael Scott, to close us out.
Thanks, Joe.
Okay. Thanks so much, Colleen. That's a terrific talk. You've covered so much material in just a short space of time. And it's been really inspiring. And thank you, Joe, for engaging in that debate. And thanks, Mike Collins, for coming in at the end with a quick reference to Hopkins, which is quite apposite, really, because the next event in our series will be on the 24th of May, when Mike Collins will be talking, and he'll be talking about T.S. Eliot's plays. Unfortunately, this will be the very last talk in this Zoom series on Christian literary imagination. And so we're just going to extend it by 15 minutes so that after Mike's talk and a few questions on that. It will follow it with a panel discussion between Catherine Temple, Joe Simmons, Mike Collins, and myself, when we'll be just looking at where we've got to in terms of Christian literary imagination, our understanding of it. And I think we've gone a bit further this afternoon than I thought before we started. So bless you, Colin, for helping us on that. Another event which you might like to note is the Free Speech Project at the Crossroads International Dialogues. We'll have an event on the Monday, the 6th of June at 4 p.m. BST, 11 a.m. EST, when we will be discussing censorship. Now, we had a meeting yesterday, a Zoom yesterday, on the Ukraine within that series. If you weren't able to see it yesterday, see it please on the Zoom on the website, because it was absolutely incredible. A debate going on, having people like Susan Eisenhower and Lord Raymond Asquith talking openly about how we'd got to this point with the Ukraine. It was an incredible moment, and Susan even at one point talks about a discussion that she had with Gorbachev, which was quite amazing. So I think if you missed it, see if you can get hold of this of the recording, which Georgetown will make available. I'd like to thank Georgetown University, those who've made this happen, of course, Mary Gordon and Julia Perillo, who make the Zooms occur. And of course, as ever, Jack DeJoy, the president, and Tom Banchoff at Campion Hall, Dr. Nick Austin, the master of the hall, and of course, Joe, my co-convener, Sarah Gray and Ying Ying at Blackfriars, Dr. Richard Finn, the director of the Las Casas Institute, Dr. John O'Connor, the regent, King Arona Gabnai, the administrator. My thanks as ever to Maggie Scott, my wife, who helps with the administrations on these. Finally, thank you all for being part of the audience. I might as well say that from next year, from October, although we won't be doing this series, we are hoping to do a new series on literature, art, and the environment. And maybe we'll include the universe in that as well, following today's discussions. But we'll see how we get on. But we'll let you know about that in due course. But please keep us in mind next Tuesday and come for the last event in this series. In the meantime, take care, keep safe. I'm Mike Scott. Please follow me on Twitter, Mike Scott Prof. Thank you. Thank you again, Colleen, for a fantastic afternoon and talk. And thank you, Joe. Goodbye.